Hi, my name is Alina Skrzeszewska. I'm the director of Game Girls. Game Girls is a documentary that's a love story between two women on Skid Row in Los Angeles.
Hey, I want to take a picture with you. Your feet hurt, you want me to carry you? Or should you just take that glass slipper off so I can find Cinderella? Which one? Say no.
Terry, can we get there?
I want to take a picture right here by this city, Skid Row city limit. What you think, Alina? No, yes. Or she can take off that glass slipper and I can find my Cinderella.
I'm not worried about everybody else. My feet hurt. This is downtown Skid Row.
Come on. Can I get you in my picture? Do you mind? You got time for that?
Come on, let's take a picture.
Let's take a picture. Let's take a picture. For real? You in a rush? Will you go? I'll take my pictures.
I'm not in a rush, Terry. Do you understand that my feet hurt? Do you understand that?
You may carry you?
No, I don't. You cannot carry me.
You're right. You're right about that.
Can we take the picture?
The pictures have been taken. Let's go.
Hi, I'm Hannah Congdon, and I'm here with Alina Skrzeszewska, who is talking about her documentary Game Girls. Hi. Nice to talk to you today.
Good to talk to you.
First of all, can you tell me a little bit about your previous works have represented individuals from this area of Skid Row, and I believe you lived there for a while. Can you tell me about your involvement with this particular area and why you wanted to represent the people from that area?
Yes, I first got to Skid Row in 2006, and I lived in a hotel for a year and a half. Around that time, between then and like 2008, it was a little bit in the beginning off and on, and then I stayed for a while in one of the hotels. And it's just something that happened. It's hard for me to really go back and know exactly why I felt so strongly drawn to it. Back then there were practical reasons too. It was the cheapest place to actually find a place. But making the first film, which was about my neighbors in those hotels, and they were men, led me to the next film because I wanted to make a film about women, and that's Game Girls. And there's always something that sort of remains unexplained that in one film, so you want to keep making the next one and the next one and the next one. So that's kind of what happened with me and Skid Row.
And you talk about wanting to represent individuals kind of living on the margins of society. What's your drive to doing that?
I think I really identify with the sort of theme of displacement that a lot of people have in their biographies and live in places like Skid Row. It's not just Skid Row, but that's a very concentrated place of displacement and also of trauma. And somehow the fractures of society become really very, very visible there, and I feel comfortable in those fractures. I identify with that based on my own biography and maybe based on some predisposition that I don't know where it comes from. But I feel it's become something of a spiritual home for me in a way. I feel very close to it.
And can you expand a little bit on the backdrop of homelessness in Skid Row and how rife an issue it is there?
Yeah, homelessness has been around for a while, but it certainly has grown over the last decades, and it has grown specifically in Skid Row and all over Los Angeles very much in the last few years. Especially as far as women and children are concerned. So, back in 2006, there was a moment where there were actually sort of less people on the street per se, which is when I first got to Skid Row, and it was very, very different. I wouldn't see all these women sort of camped out in tents along San Pedro, but right now when you walk down there, it's a lot of women. And kids too. So it always changes, but it's a huge issue.
Yeah, and the film follows this lesbian couple of Terry and Tiana. How did you get to know them, and how did you So I was wondering, it's a very intimate portrait of their lives, and I wondered, how did you gain their trust and acceptance of the fact that you were going to film quite intimate parts of their lives?
So when I made that first film, which was about men, and I wanted to make another one about women, I knew that I wanted to find a different format for that. I wanted to find a different way of representation and figuring out how to really make a portrait sort of involving the women in making that portrait. Just trying to figure out how to do that. So I knew I needed some kind of a workshop space. I needed a safe space for people to come and meet and kind of talk and get to know each other in a deeper way. I ended up finding a drama therapist to facilitate that workshop. Her name is Mimi Savage, brilliant woman, and she facilitated the workshops throughout the entire time, which they ran for a year and a half. So in order to spread the word, we kind of canvassed the whole area with flyers, the whole neighborhood. We spoke to social service providers, et cetera, and we advertised a free expressive arts workshop, and also that we're going to be making a film. And Terry was there the very first day that we started the workshop, which was January 29th, 2014. She was there, and she kept coming, and it became a very, very important place or space for her to come to. So that's how it started. And she was inviting me to things. She was inviting me to shoot stuff with her. She wanted to be in the film, and I liked her, and that's how it happened.
And she, well, both of them were comfortable.
And then the relationship with Tiana started a little bit later. So then Terry started bringing Tiana into the workshop as well. I mean, we had already been shooting outside of the workshops, but then Terry started bringing Tiana into the workshops. And at some point, the roles switched a little bit, where Tiana actually was making sure that Terry was attending, because she realized it was a good thing for them to come.
Which is interesting, actually, because that happens a little bit. And we see that shift in their relationship in the film.
Yeah.
And in the film, the issue of homosexuality, it's not sort of addressed directly. It's just a fact. It's not discussed specifically, other than I think there's only one point where Terry refers to herself as a black lesbian. But I wondered, what is it like for homosexual men or women living in Skid Row? Is it more vulnerable as someone who's gay, or is it an okay life?
So for me, it wasn't about making a film about a lesbian couple. That's just kind of what happened. What I knew I wanted to do was a film about a relationship, a very deep and intimate relationship between two people. I was initially thinking maybe it's going to be a mother-daughter story, but it ended up being this love story. So it really wasn't the initial focus for me. As far as being more vulnerable, there's two sides to that. As women, generally women are more vulnerable on Skid Row than men. There is definitely a huge issue as far as especially transgender women of color, as far as violence, and actually murder rates are really alarming for specifically transgender women of color, and a lot of them are on Skid Row because it is a space where people go that are not accepted in a lot of other spaces, or sometimes are sent to. So it's complicated, because even while the violence is happening at the same time, there is an acceptance within the community that doesn't necessarily happen elsewhere. So Terry comes from a Jehovah's Witness background. She was put out of her family for being gay when she was 16 years old. This is a place where it's just, it's not, she can be who she wants to be in that way.
Okay. And you talked kind of about issues of violence just then, and particularly against women. In the drama workshop groups, the issue of sexual violence comes up significantly, and from conversations that we hear in the backdrop in your filming on the streets in Skid Row, we can hear a lot of aggression, sort of verbal abuse of women. How can the women in these situations actually escape from those cycles of violence when they're seemingly starting so young?
To some, Skid Row is an escape. So a lot of the women come to Skid Row because they leave domestic violence, relationships with domestic violence. And then there's nowhere else to go because they don't have access to resources and they end up in a shelter and so forth. So that is one path for a lot of women to get there. As far as specifically sexual abuse in general in childhood, it does seem to be, we heard a lot of stories. I mean, it seemed like it was kind of a prevailing theme, and it seems like that is something that people who are put by us in places, in very kind of undesirable places like prisons and jails. If you look at the statistics, actually it turns out that, like, I read the statistics somewhere, like 95% of the women have experienced childhood abuse, and mostly sexual abuse, and then they become incarcerated. So it's a perverted kind of idea of incarcerating the victim. So it's a very, very difficult conversation.
Yeah. And one of the things that also comes out of the conversation in the drum workshops is actually it's not just men who are perpetrators of that kind of violence, it was also women and mothers. And I thought that was just quite interesting, in that it's coming from both genders or both sexes. Yeah.
I think what's really necessary to always keep in mind that there is a link between the institutional violence that people experience in their everyday lives, and I try to sort of show that in the film also by just the even kind of visual and visceral violence that you see the police in the area putting on, and how that influences, how that sort of transports into personal relationships. So unfortunately there's a link.
And did you feel, it seemed like a lot of the women in the workshop were actually exploring things maybe for the first time, or things that they hadn't necessarily said out loud before. Did you feel like the workshops actually helped quite a few of the individuals that went there?
It does seem that that's the case. It does seem to be the case for a lot of women. I mean, we've got very, very, it's been a very touching journey, the whole thing with the workshops, because what happened is that we really kind of ended up creating a community which, would be kind of a dream project, and we didn't really know what was going to happen, or we didn't,
And has it continued at all?
The workshops have not continued, the community has continued. So the women who formed a sort of core group and really committed to it kept coming, and most of them have moved on, and they are in better places in their lives. Like, a lot of them moved out of Skid Row, they got housing, et cetera, and they support each other, they bring each other food, give each other rides, et cetera, talk on Facebook all the time, stuff like that. So it has become very, very important, and that was really an awesome thing to see for me.
The issue of mental health comes up a lot, and Terry herself struggles quite a lot with mental health issues, and it's very sensitively portrayed in the film. But I wondered, what kind of support is there for mental health if you are living on the streets in Skid Row? I mean, there seems to be, like you were saying, a big community on Skid Row of people looking after each other, but from actual social welfare organisations, is there the necessary support there or not?
There's a lot of nonprofits, there's a lot of projects, there's a lot of stuff that's trying to address mental health on Skid Row. How it does that, and if it does that effectively, is a whole different question, and Terry talks about that, how there's doctors, there's therapists that walk from building to building, and they just kind of, check off the paperwork or whatever, so she doesn't necessarily feel like that's really doing anything. It's all like a huge bureaucracy, it's a whole system. Even the guy who's part of that system essentially says the system is broken, which it is. So, and when she talks about her medication, having to take 5 different medications, there's a lot of really absurd things. Clearly, it's not working. I mean, there's a lot of efforts. And it's something that hopefully, there's a little bit more awareness in terms of how mental health really has become part of incarceration. So that's kind of like where people with mental illness are pushed into, is to prisons and jails. And those have become like the largest mental hospitals in the US. And there's a little bit more awareness maybe now over the past few years to trying to do some changes, make some changes in California. But yeah, it's a question of how to survive in society if you have an impairment, if you can't function at maximum necessity in a high-powered capitalist, completely unequal world, then with an additional disability, what are you going to do? I mean, it's not enough.
And you just touched on the, sort of prisons and police authority, and that's a prominent theme in the film, and we kind of have this constant presence of police in the background. We hear the sirens all the time and flashing lights all the time. And it was really interesting in the opening scene when we're actually taken inside the prison and the camera hovers over the pictures of staff and they're all white. I wondered, could you expand a little bit more on the relations that you witnessed between the people living on Skid Row and the police authorities while you were there?
It's not, at this point with the LAPD, it's more complicated than being a racial issue of the sort that all the police officers are white. They are not. I mean, generally speaking, all over, everywhere in society, in higher up hierarchical places, it tends to be whiter and whiter and whiter. Yeah. But as far as on the street level, I mean, we do see a lot of black cops on Skid Row and just in LA in general. I mean, the LAPD has actually reformed since the 90s, since after the riots, and has sort of tried to adopt a little bit of a different strategy. But the larger problem is that the whole concept of militarization of the police. So it didn't used to be that you would see that level of weaponry on an everyday basis. That really has just completely exploded. So when people, what people see in Skid Row of the police, it really is a little bit like an occupying force in a war zone. They're constantly present, and it feels very, very violent. Even though the police officers themselves, a lot of them, they are trying to make a sincere effort, but it's just the system is a whole different story. Because not every cop is a jerk. It's not like that. But they're part of a system that's oppressive. And as far as police violence, that's an issue, and that happened, for example, with the killing of a man whose name was in the community, Africa, in 2015, who was killed for absolutely no reason, shot down by police, and so there were protests, and that's how the Black Lives Matter movement sort of linked up with Skid Row also at the time.
And Terry's involved in that protest as well.
Yeah, they're sort of a little bit passers-by. They're in and out. Yeah. They're not activists. They experience they experience the problem. They experience that oppression, but they're not on that side of the full-on activist.
And towards the end of the film, we do finally see Terry and Tiana get their home, but there are still kind of some issues with their relationship and things beyond that point. I was wondering, are you still in touch with them, and how are they doing now, and have they seen the film?
Yes, so I am in touch with them. Terry texts me all the time. Not right this moment because she's in a recovery program for 90 days, so she can't talk to anybody, which is kind of a little bit ironic that this is happening right now as the film is premiering. So I guess that answers your question to a large extent. Yeah.
And have they seen the film?
Oh yeah. They have absolutely seen the film. Yes,
Okay.
they've seen the film in multiple. They've seen multiple edits of the film actually. So basically, throughout the process of making the film, it was very important for me to have the community space of the workshop as a sort of feedback space where I could go and kind of figure out, are these issues relevant? Is something portrayed in a way that's not useful? Is that like how to do it? So I was able to incorporate that feedback into the film, and they've seen it and they loved the final version. I mean, Terry cried. So
I would imagine it's quite moving watching some of that back.
Yeah. But luckily, some of the older ladies who were in the workshop gave her a lot of support and gave her a lot of good advice. And so yeah, those screenings just for the workshop, for the women in the workshop, and in that contained space, and with Mimi, the drama therapist, were always a really, really moving and important step in making the film.
Okay.
And for their lives,
Yeah. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Today. Yeah. Good luck with the premiere.
Thanks.